He found a starving Apache child on the. 4 days later, 3 Apache women stood at his door.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Arizona Territory, winter, 1882. Reed Halston didn't much care for the North Fence. The stretch ran crooked through brittle brush and sun-bleached rocks, always needing mending, always too far from the cabin to bother with unless something pushed him out there, a broken post, an animal getting through, or the gut feeling something wasn't right. That morning, it was the last one. He'd woken early, same as always. Fed the mules, checked the shed door that never quite latched right, ground his coffee by hand, slow and steady, the way he did everything. His cabin, rough timber walls, one stovepipe, a roof patched with bark and hope, had stood quiet through the night. No visitors, no sounds but the wind. But still, something had gnawed at him, a pull in the gut. He tried to ignore it. Didn't work. So now he rode northeast, through wind that cut clean through his coat and left the back of his hands raw. The plains were wide and open, the kind of land that hid nothing, except when it did. Years ago, he'd learned to look not for what was there, but what wasn't. The absence of movement, the shape that didn't belong. That's what caught his eye. At first glance, it was just a mound in the dirt, low and slumped near the base of the fence post where the wire curled loose. It might have been a sack or a coyote carcass, the kind that got dragged by buzzards and half covered by wind-blown grit. But it wasn't. He slowed the mule and dismounted, boots crunching in the cold soil. He approached with a cautious eye. One hand stayed near his holster out of habit, though his gut already told him it wasn't danger. It was something worse. It was a child, a boy, Apache by the look of him, no more than 5 or 6, curled into himself like something trying to disappear. Barefoot, his ribs showed through the skin. One cheek lay against the hard ground, his lips dry and split. His hands were small, fingers stiff and turning color. He wore a thin buckskin shirt torn along one sleeve. No coat, no blanket. The ash from a small campfire had blown over and mixed with his hair. Reed crouched, let out a breath through his nose. He looked around. No tracks, no smoke, no movement in any direction. Just that boy, dying slow and alone. Reed hesitated, not because he didn't care, but because he'd been alone for years, and taking someone in wasn't a small thing. Not out here, not with winter just beginning to show its teeth. The last person he'd held in his arms had been his wife, 6 years earlier, dying in a bed that smelled of sickness and pine oil. Since then, it had just been him, the mules, and the cattle. That was by choice. This wasn't. He pulled off his heavy coat, thick canvas lined with wool, the only thing that had kept him warm through last winter, and wrapped it around the boy with careful hands. He didn't speak. The boy couldn't hear anyway, not in that state. Reed slid his arms beneath the child, lifted him gently, and felt just how light he was. Nearly weightless, bones and skin. As he turned back toward the mule, the wind picked up again. It hit his chest and made him squint. He looked out across the empty plains once more, hoping to spot someone, anyone. But there was nothing. He muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the boy. All right then. He rode back to the cabin with the boy cradled in one arm, reins loose in the other hand. Each hoofbeat pounded a little more clarity into his chest. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a handout. This was his responsibility now. The ride took 20 minutes. He didn't rush it. Inside the cabin, the stove was still warm from the morning burn. He fed the fire with dry cedar, then cleared the cot near it. He laid the boy down gently, his own coat still wrapped around him, and felt the chill leave the child's skin in slow waves. He fetched water, heated it, washed the boy's hands with a cloth, noticed the cuts, the dirt ground deep into his fingernails, and the purple bruises along his upper arms. Reed didn't ask what had happened. The boy couldn't have answered anyway. He made broth, thinned down beans with fat, salt, and water, and let it cool in a tin cup. He knelt down, lifted the boy's head slightly, and pressed the edge of the cup to his lips. The boy swallowed. That was enough. Reed stayed there beside him for a long while, kneeling on the cabin floor with his knees aching and one hand resting on the boy's shoulder. Not out of comfort, but to remind himself this was real, that someone else was breathing in his home again. Someone else mattered. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in a chair by the stove, watching the boy's chest rise and fall beneath the furs, listening to the wind hammer the walls. There was no plan, no explanation, just the fact that something in him refused to let that child die out there alone, even if he didn't know what came next. The boy didn't speak that first day, or the next. Reed Halston didn't press him. He didn't try to coax a name, or a word, or a story. The boy ate what was given, drank when prompted, and slept more than anything else. When he was awake, his eyes followed Reed, never fully trusting, but never afraid either. Just watching. Reed fixed the busted hinge on the door, split more firewood, rechecked the fence line, and fed the cattle. He moved through his routine with the same quiet discipline he always had, but now there was an extra plate on the table, and he cooked more than one portion at a time. It didn't take much thought. He just did it. That's how he'd lived since the war. Do the next thing, then the next. Don't think past tomorrow. By the third evening, the boy stood on his own, barefoot near the stove, holding the cup Reed handed him with both hands. His legs were still unsteady. Reed noticed the boy glance at the door more than once, like he was waiting for someone. Reed set his coffee down and leaned forward in the chair. "Someone coming for you?" he asked plainly. The boy didn't answer. His fingers curled tighter around the cup. Reed didn't ask again. But that question, "Is someone coming for you?" stuck in the back of his mind as the fire crackled low. The next morning, the answer came. It was just past dawn, before the sun had risen over the ridgeline. Reed had stepped outside to fetch kindling when the mule snorted sharply and backed up from the fence. Reed followed the mule's gaze. There, in the pale gray light, stood 3 figures on foot. Women. Apache. Close enough now that their breaths showed in the cold air. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood on a rise above the cabin, the breeze tugging gently at their long skirts and braided hair. Reed felt his gut tighten. He looked back toward the cabin, where the boy still slept. Then he turned to face them. They were worn. That was the first thing he noticed. Not just tired, but worn down. Their moccasins were covered in dust and crusted mud. Their dresses, long deerskin, stitched with beadwork and shell, were torn at the seams and hanging loose in places. One carried a wrapped bundle strapped across her back. Another had what looked like an old hunting knife tied to her belt with a bit of cloth. Their cheeks were sunburned raw, their arms thin. The one in front, clearly the oldest, stepped forward alone. She had a strong body, curved, wide at the hips, with a chest full and lifted beneath the loosened laces of a torn bodice. Her dress had been mended in places with leather patches, but the front still gapped open enough to reveal the top of her breasts, rising and falling with breath. Her eyes didn't waver. Her voice, when it came, was low and even. "You have our son," she said. No anger, no threat, just fact. Reed's jaw clenched. His mind worked quick. The boy had said nothing, but the signs were all there. This woman, this mother, had been searching. For days, probably. Maybe longer. He looked past her to the other 2 women. One was younger, with loose dark hair and eyes that scanned the cabin and the trees beyond. The other clung to her side, slender and hunched, lips pressed tight together. Reed said nothing for a moment. His pulse was steady, but his body was alert, his shoulders tight. He looked the eldest in the eyes. "He's inside, still asleep." She nodded once, then waited. Reed hesitated. He had every reason not to trust strangers at his doorstep. Apache or not, 3 desperate adults appearing unannounced in winter carried risk. But he also knew what it meant to lose someone, to follow tracks for days, hoping the next trail marker would lead somewhere. And he knew what it meant when the trail ended at your door. He stepped back. "Come in," he said. They moved silently. No questions, no hesitation. When they entered the cabin, the warmth hit them in the face. Their bodies stiffened with the change. Reed watched as the eldest crossed the floor quickly and dropped to her knees beside the cot. The boy stirred, blinking. Then his eyes lit up. He scrambled into her arms without a sound, burying his face into the curve of her chest. She wrapped around him tight, hands over his back, her head bowing low until her lips touched his hair. The other 2 women stood in the shadows near the wall, watching with wide eyes but not approaching. The boy didn't cry. Neither did she. They just held on. Reed poured water into a tin cup and slid it across the table. Then he opened the larder, brought out what little was left, jerky, hard bread, a few dried beans, and placed them near the stove. "Eat," he said. The women didn't move right away. Then the tallest, still clutching the boy, reached up and took a piece of bread, broke it, gave a portion to him, then another to the other women. They ate slowly, deliberately, quietly. After a long silence, she looked up at Reed again. "I am Asha," she said. He nodded once. "Reed." Another beat passed. "Why did you help him?" she asked. Not angry, just trying to understand. Reed rubbed the back of his neck. Didn't feel right leaving him. Asha held his gaze for a long second. "No," she said softly. "It wouldn't have been." That night, the women stayed. Reed offered no promises, gave no welcome speeches. He simply laid out extra furs near the stove, added more wood to the fire, and made sure the water pot stayed full. He cleaned his rifle before bed, as always. But when he glanced up, he noticed something different. The cabin wasn't empty anymore. And for the first time in a long while, that didn't feel like a threat. It felt like something starting. The morning came gray and dry, the kind that carried no warmth despite the sun rising over the ridge. Reed Halston stood by the stove, adding split wood to the flame while the iron kettle rattled faintly beside him. His shoulders ached from a rough night's sleep in the chair, but he didn't show it. Behind him, the cabin was quieter than usual, but not silent. The boy was curled up again near the fire, tucked tightly into a pile of folded furs. His mother, Asha, kneeling beside him. She hadn't slept much, that much was clear. Her long dark hair was still braided tight, though dust clung to the ends. Her dress, frayed deerskin, patched at the seams, hung loose over her curves, the laces at her chest half-tied. One hand rested on the boy's back. The other remained on her own thigh, still and steady. Reed didn't ask what they had run from. He figured he didn't need to. The other two women had stayed close to the shadows of the room. The younger one, Rin, as he would later learn, kept her back near the wall, eyes sharp, not saying a word. The softer one, Tallulah, seemed older than she probably was, moving gently, carefully like someone used to avoiding loud noises. She stood now near the window, looking out across the scrubland with a face that said she didn't expect much good to come from the day. Reed watched them all from behind his coffee mug. He wasn't used to this company, noise, breathing that didn't belong to him. He had never invited anyone to stay this long before, not even the supply drivers from Bisbee. And yet, he hadn't asked them to leave either. He wasn't sure what that meant. "I need to check the fence," he said after a while. It came out dry and flat. No one answered, but Asha's head tilted just slightly, and Reed knew she'd heard him. He grabbed his coat, holstered the rifle, and stepped out into the cold. The door thudded shut behind him. The fence line was a quarter-mile walk from the cabin, the wind sweeping across the hard-pan earth as if trying to strip it bare. Reed checked the posts one by one, finding a few loose wires and one corner that had been rubbed by a deer or coyote. He worked with gloved hands, driving in a splint, twisting the wire taut. His breath fogged in the air, but his mind wasn't on the work. He kept thinking about what Asha had said the night before. "You have our son. Not my son, not the boy. Our son." That meant something, maybe not the way most would read it, but to Reed, it hinted at a bond between those women, not just blood but shared survival. Maybe they weren't related by family. Maybe they were all that was left of something that used to be bigger. A tribe, a camp, a community. One wiped out or scattered. He'd seen it before. Reed had served as a Union scout back in '64, mostly in the Arizona Territory. He'd seen both sides of the ugly truth, what men in uniform did to Apache families and what was done back in return. He didn't talk about it, but it never left him. Not fully. That boy had survived something. So had the women. And now, they were inside his home. When he returned near midday, the smell of cooked beans met him before he even stepped inside. Tallulah had taken to the stove. The boy sat upright now. Next to her, legs crossed beneath him, chewing slowly on a strip of bread. His face was less sunken today, his eyes brighter. Rin was still on edge, but she now stood near the stove. Her dress, shorter than the others, revealed her legs to the thigh, and she was still barefoot despite the cold. Reed glanced down at her feet. Cracked skin, bleeding in places. He pulled his gaze back up without comment. "You're welcome to boots," he said to no one in particular. "Got extra. Might not fit, but better than that." Rin didn't answer, but Asha did. From her seat near the cot, she looked up at him and nodded once. "We'll take care of our own." Reed didn't argue. He poured himself a mug of coffee and stood in the doorway, watching them all. It struck him again. This cabin had never held this many people before. Not even when he and his wife were first settling the land. It had always been a place of silence, a place to keep the world out. Now it was full. He thought of asking how long they planned to stay, but something in him resisted. The question would make it real, make it temporary. Instead, he said nothing. That evening, as the light faded and the hills turned blue, Asha stepped outside. She didn't say where she was going, just wrapped Reed's coat around her shoulders. The same coat she had returned to him folded and brushed clean, and walked down toward the creek bed, where dried reeds bent in the wind. Reed followed at a distance, not too close, but not so far that she'd think he didn't care. She stopped near a cluster of stones, knelt, said something under her breath in a language he didn't understand. Her back rose and fell in a slow rhythm, like she was measuring her breath carefully. Reed stood a few paces behind, watching. When she rose again, she turned to face him. Her eyes were not wet, but they were heavy. "You didn't ask what happened to us," she said. He shook his head. "Didn't think you'd tell me if I did." She nodded. "Then, we hid the boy during a raid. Covered him with brush. We ran. Took us days to find the place again. And when we did, there was nothing left." Reed looked down, let out a slow breath. "You came a long way." "Yes." He hesitated, then said, "You're safe here." She didn't thank him, just looked at him with something unreadable. Maybe respect, maybe caution. Then she walked past him, slowly, the edge of her torn dress brushing his leg as she passed. That night, no one asked for space. The boy curled against Asha under the furs. Tallulah stretched beside the fire. Ren sat cross-legged near the window with Reed's coat draped over her knees. Reed sat in the chair, eyes half shut, rifle across his lap, as always. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now they were all still here, and that was enough. The days came colder after that. Morning started before the light did, the inside of the cabin crusted with frost at the window edges. Reed woke early, as always, but now he wasn't alone in the quiet. There were the soft breaths of the boy, buried under furs near the stove. Tallulah's gentle stirrings as she rolled her stiff joints and stood, always the first to move after Reed. Ren remained still longer, eyes barely open, watching, assessing, even half awake. And Asha, she lay silent but alert, always closest to the boy, her arm draped across him like a promise that wouldn't be broken again. Reed noticed the cabin felt smaller now. Not in a bad way, just filled. The wood creaked different under more footsteps. The kettle emptied faster. Firewood disappeared twice as quick. But no one complained. They all moved in rhythm, like they'd done this before, or at least understood what it meant to survive winter with others. Routine, silence, and making use of every scrap. That morning, as he pulled on his coat and opened the door, the wind rushed in sharp and dry, cutting across the yard with a howl that stirred the cattle in the pen. He stepped outside and immediately noticed Asha behind him. She had followed, barefoot except for worn moccasins, her arms pulled tight across her chest. The loose laces of her deerskin dress parted at her chest again, more from wear than intent, but Reed looked away out of instinct and respect. "You're cold," he muttered. She said nothing, just tightened her arms. Without thinking, he shrugged off his coat again and handed it to her. She hesitated, eyes narrowing, not out of fear but pride. "Take it," he said plainly. "I'm moving." "You're not." She reached out and took the coat. Her fingers brushed his for a second, warm skin against rough, calloused hands. She slid the coat over her shoulders and stood still in it for a moment, looking at him. Her expression softened slightly. "You give away your coat too easy," she said. Reed gave a short shrug. "Only got one of you standing there shivering." That was the first time she almost smiled. They went to the corral together. Asha stayed quiet, watching how he checked the gate, how he ran a hand along the mule's flank, how he scooped a few handfuls of oats into the trough and ran his boot through the frozen mud to check drainage. She followed, stepping carefully, her body moving with quiet confidence. She didn't ask to help. She just picked up the feed sack when it slipped from the hook and held it open for him. He noticed she didn't wear gloves. Her fingers were red from the cold. "You used to horses?" he asked. "Not your kind," she answered. "Ours were faster, smaller, could use the help." She didn't answer, but she stayed. Back in the cabin, Tallulah had started soup. Reed could smell the fat from salted pork and wild onions warming in the pot. The boy was playing now, quietly, with a stick he dragged along the edge of the hearthstone. Rin sat near him, her legs pulled up under her, one hand lazily turning a small leather pouch over and over between her fingers. Reed took a seat by the table. His muscles ached. His lower back had stiffened from carrying with the day before. But he said nothing. Later, while the women ate, Asha stood and moved to the wash basin. She dipped a cloth into the warm water and knelt in front of Ren, who flinched slightly. Asha said nothing, just took her sister's foot, bare, cracked, bleeding in spots, and began to clean it. Reed watched from across the room. He realized then, they weren't just women traveling together. They were holding each other together. Not blood sisters, maybe, but something older, something earned. He watched as Asha wrapped the foot in a clean strip of cotton she'd torn from her own hem. Ren didn't speak, but her head lowered, her chin dipped. It was the closest thing to a thank you Reed had seen her give. That night, after the fire was built up high and the wind shook the windows in hard bursts, Reed sat by the stove, cleaning the rifle. He noticed Asha standing near the door, staring at the latch. "You worried someone's still out there?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "The men who burned our camp, they won't come this far. Not on foot, but if they sold information, they won't." Reed cut in. "Calm. Certain." She looked at him. "You don't know that." "No," he said, "but I've seen men like that. They don't chase what they think's already dead." Asha nodded slightly, but her fingers lingered near the doorframe, rubbing the rough wood like she was memorizing the grain. He set the rifle down. "You're not alone here," he said. She turned slowly, her body outlined in the firelight, his coat still draped over her frame. It slid slightly off one shoulder, revealing the smooth line of skin down to her collarbone. She didn't pull it back up, just stood there. "You didn't ask for this," she said. Reed shook his head. "No one did." "Still," she added quietly, "you didn't close your door." He didn't speak, didn't need to. The wind outside rose again, rattling the latch, then fell quiet. Asha walked over, slow and steady, and sat near the stove, not beside him, but close enough that their knees nearly touched. "You lost someone," she said. "My wife," he replied after a pause. 6 years ago. Pneumonia." Asha looked into the fire. "I lost everyone. In one night." They sat there, not speaking, while the fire popped and the boys' breathing steadied into sleep behind them. No one moved to put out the lamps. No one told anyone where to sleep. And when Asha reached forward and adjusted the log in the fire with a stick, her bare arm brushed Reed's. She didn't pull away, and neither did he. Snow came hard that week. It started as a dusting across the ridge one morning, but by the next night the ground was blanketed, thick and heavy, pushing down on everything. The branches of the mesquite trees bent low, the mule's pen filled with drifts. The air itself seemed quieter, muted beneath the weight of winter settling in. Reed Halston woke early and stayed up late, working to keep the cabin warm, the animals fed, and the roof clear before it sagged under snow it wasn't built to carry. But this time, he wasn't doing it alone. Asha took to the routines without being told. She chopped wood without asking. She fed the mule, then came inside and warmed her fingers by the stove before helping Tallulah with whatever was cooking. She still wore her deerskin dress, patched, frayed, stubbornly low at the chest, but now was layered with the coat Reed had given her and a wool scarf she'd found in his storage trunk. She carried herself the same way each day, quiet, focused, with a kind of patient strength Reed respected deeply. Ren still kept distance. She said little, watched everything. But her tension had eased. She no longer flinched when Reed entered a room. She took the boy outside once, just to walk him around the edge of the cabin and back. He returned red-cheeked and laughing, the first real sound of joy Reed had heard from him since he'd been found. The boy, whose name they now spoke as Tocho, had begun to talk in whispers, mostly to Asha, sometimes to Tallulah, never to Reed, but he followed him around the yard when Reed was hauling water or checking traps. He didn't ask questions, just mirrored his movements like he was trying to learn something by doing it. Reed didn't mind. It reminded him of simpler days, before everything had gone quiet in his world. One afternoon, as the snow let up for a few hours, Asha helped Reed clear a trail to the chicken shed. They worked side by side, not speaking. She moved with natural rhythm, her body strong and capable. At one point, she stopped to brush snow from her sleeve and caught Reed watching her. He looked away quickly, but she didn't. "You used to live with people," she said. Not a question, an observation. Reed nodded once. "A long time ago. Soldiers, scouts, then cattlemen, then just me and her." Asha glanced toward the cabin. "The wife you lost." "Yeah. She died here, in the bed." Silence. Then Asha said, "It's a good place to die. Warm, covered." Reed didn't respond. He tightened the grip on the shovel and cleared another path in the snow. That night, after dinner, rabbit stew and hard bread, they sat together in the cabin as the wind howled outside. Tallulah had taken to sewing a rip in Ren's sleeve. Tocho lay curled with his head on Asha's lap, thumb near his mouth but not quite in it. He was getting stronger, eating more, breathing easier. The purplish tint in his fingers had faded. Reed sat sharpening his blade in the corner, half focused, half listening to the way the cabin sounded with people inside it. Real people, moving, living, not ghosts. Asha stroked Tocho's hair, her hand moving slow and steady. "He needs a father," she said suddenly. Reed looked up, startled by the directness. "I'm not asking you for anything," she added, reading his face. "I'm just saying he needs one." Reed nodded. "He'll grow into his own." "Maybe," she said, "but boys that don't have men to follow, they either grow wild or hard. Sometimes both." Reed leaned back in his chair, stared at the fire a long time. "I'm not much for talking," he said finally. "Never was." "You don't have to talk," she said, without looking at him. "Just stay." Later that night, after the others had bedded down, Reed remained awake, sitting near the stove, watching the last of the coals burn. The wind outside had softened. Snowflakes tapped gently against the window pane. Asha came up beside him, wrapped in his coat, her bare feet quiet on the wood floor. She didn't speak. She just stood there near him. Her hand brushed his shoulder, then rested there. Reed didn't move. He closed his eyes and let it stay. No promises were made. No decisions declared. But in that moment, something that had been locked deep inside him shifted. Not all the way, just enough. The days passed slower in deep winter, but each one carried more weight. The snow didn't lift. It hardened, froze into crusty ridges along the eaves, drifted high against the fence posts, and sealed the landscape in quiet. Reed Halston moved through it without complaint. He kept the paths shoveled, the animals fed, the traps checked. His hands stayed raw, and his breath never stopped showing in the cold air. But he worked with steadiness, because now there was more than himself to keep alive. Inside the cabin, warmth held. Barely. The stove burned near constant. Tallulah had gotten good at rationing the wood supply, stretching the heat through long nights with smaller kindling stacks and smart burns. She and Ren now shared tasks without speaking much. There were no assigned roles, no rules. They just watched what needed doing and did it. And Asha, she had stopped standing apart. She was beside Reed now often, not clinging, just there, in the stable helping him lift water buckets, in the yard brushing snow off the mule's back, at the fire while he whittled, threading broken laces from his coat into new straps. Sometimes when they passed each other indoors, their shoulders would graze. Her dress was still the same, mended, stretched tight across her chest, but now it had layers. Reed's coat, a wool blanket draped like a shawl, a leather belt pulled snug at her waist. The clothes didn't hide her figure, but they didn't try to show it either. She looked like a woman with purpose, grounded, present. That night, after Tocho had been put to bed and Tallulah was tending a cracked seam in Ren's skirt, Asha approached Reed without hesitation. He was at the workbench, filing down a sliver of wood for a broken latch. "You never asked what we were before," she said. Reed didn't look up. Didn't figure it mattered. "It might," she said, her tone unreadable. He set the file down, turned slowly. "We weren't wives," she said plainly. "Not all of us. Not in the way white folks use the word. We were what was left after the men were taken. By soldiers, or rival bands, or sickness." Reed nodded once. No judgment on his face. Just listening. "They call us cursed," she added. "Our own people, I mean, because we lived." "You don't look cursed," Reed said. Asha tilted her head. "You don't flinch when you say that." "I don't flinch at much anymore." Asha stepped closer. She stood just in front of him now, not touching, but close enough he could smell the faint earth scent on her skin. Her breath, warm, met his jaw. "You look at me," she said, voice quiet, "but you don't take." Reed's throat tightened. His hand stayed still. Asha studied his face. Then, very slowly, she reached up and placed one hand along his cheek. Her thumb brushed the ridge of an old scar near his jawline. Reed didn't move, didn't break her gaze. "You don't have to do anything," she said. "But if you want to, I would stay." Still, he didn't speak. She leaned in, closing the distance in slow inches. Her hand guided his face until her lips hovered near his. Then she kissed him. It was soft, careful, deliberate. A moment that felt like it had been building silently through shared glances, brushed shoulders, unspoken agreements to stay close and keep surviving. Reed didn't pull away. He let it happen, closed his eyes and returned it, gently with restraint. His hand moved to the curve of her waist, over the belt, over the fabric, holding her like something fragile but not breakable. They didn't speak after, but that night, when the others lay down, Asha stayed near him by the fire. She didn't take his hand. She didn't need to. She just sat next to him, her thigh against his, her head eventually tipping to his shoulder. And Reed didn't shift away. He stayed still, because for the first time in years, someone had chosen to stay beside him not out of need, but out of want. And that mattered, even if no one said it aloud. Earlier that day, Tallulah had quietly asked what they planned to do come spring. Reed hadn't answered. But now, as the wind slowed outside and the fire warmed the wood floor beneath their feet, the answer began to form in his chest. Simple, steady, sure. They wouldn't go anywhere. The thaw began with sound before it showed in sight. Water dripped faintly from the edge of the roof one morning, just enough to catch Reed Halston's ear as he stepped outside to check the traps. The air was still cold, but it had softened. The light, too, was changing with more yellow in it now than silver. Beneath the snow, the earth hadn't given up. It was waiting. Inside the cabin, the change was slower but just as sure. The quiet between the five of them had become something warm, not empty. Even Ren, who still rarely spoke, now smiled. Once or twice at Tocho's antics. Once when Reed passed her a cup of coffee without a word. Tallulah began humming again when she cooked. Her soft voice drifted around the room and made the place feel like a home instead of a bunker. Tocho laughed more often now, sometimes loud enough to wake early. He followed Reed into the barn every morning, dragging a broom or a stick, mimicking him with small, clumsy movements. The boy didn't speak much still, but he didn't need to. Reed taught by showing, not by talking. One morning, Asha joined them. She stood beside Reed while he brushed down the mule. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hands bare. The low-cut deerskin dress she still wore showed her curves clearly when she bent forward, but Reed had stopped reacting to it. Not because he didn't notice, but because he did, and because noticing no longer felt like weakness. It felt like trust. He handed her the brush. "You ever done this?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, don't matter. Mule won't complain." She laughed, short, unexpected, real. They brushed together in silence for a while. The barn smelled of straw, leather, and animal warmth. Sunlight pushed in through the broken slats in narrow beams. Reed glanced over at her. She looked calm, solid, like she belonged here. Later, as they walked back to the cabin, Asha stopped, and looked across the land. Snow still blanketed most of it, but the path they'd worn down to the shed was muddy now, not frozen. Soon, she said. Reed followed her eyes. Soon what? Soon it'll be green again. Then what? He didn't answer. She turned toward him. We don't plan to take the boy and leave, Reed. If that's what you're worried about. He shook his head. Wasn't. I'm not asking for anything, she said. No promise. No land. But I won't pretend like this isn't something. Reed's mouth tightened. He wasn't good with declarations. She stepped closer. You never asked what I want. You tell me if you wanted to. I want to stop moving, she said. I want Tocho to grow up without running. I want Ren to sleep without a knife in her hand. I want Tallulah to hum without looking over her shoulder. Her voice softened. And I want to wake up near someone who doesn't expect me to give him anything just to stay alive. Reed met her gaze. You have that now, he said. All of it. She studied him, long and quiet. You mean that? He nodded. I would not have let you stay if I didn't. She took his hand. First time she'd done it in full daylight, without caution, and placed it gently on her waist. Not to seduce, not to tempt, just to connect. I want to be yours, she said plainly. But only if you want me that way. Not because I'm here. Not because I'm soft. Because you see me. Reed looked down at her hand, then back up into her eyes. Her chest rose beneath the old deerskin, warm breath fogging in the cold air between them. His hand stayed where she placed it. Then he pulled her gently into his arms and held her. Not urgently, just long enough. That night, Reed cleared a place on the mantel. He moved the old photograph of his wife to the shelf and replaced it with the beaded pouch Tallulah had placed near the window. He didn't say why. No one asked. They all understood. In the dark, Asha lay beside him for the first time. Truly beside him, under the same furs, her skin warm against his, her arm across his chest. No one snuck away to sleep by the fire. No one stood guard. The boy dreamed peacefully. The cabin didn't feel like borrowed space anymore. It felt like home, and no one planned to leave. The snow melted fast after the first rain. Mud slicked the path from the cabin to the barn. Water spilled down from the hills and soaked the land, flooding the dry wash and turning the once brittle soil to heavy earth underfoot. Reed Halston stood on the porch that morning with a shovel in hand, the scent of thawed pine and wet dust heavy in the air. Steam rose off the roof with the sun. For the first time in months, birds had returned, low swooping swallows darting around the edge of the yard like they'd been waiting for the right signal. Inside, the cabin had changed in quiet ways. The furs were folded into a neat pile now instead of scattered. The cracked window pane had been patched with a square of oiled canvas, sewn neatly by Ren. The larder was better organized. The boy, Tocho, had a woven mat where he curled at night instead of sleeping by the stove, and Tallulah had made it clear with soft words that he needed structure now, not just warmth. He didn't argue. He'd begun calling her auntie in Apache under his breath, and sometimes she let herself smile when he did. Reed moved slower these days. Not from age, but from observation. He watched more, took time to notice things he used to pass by. He noticed the way Ren had stopped keeping a knife hidden under her blanket. The way Tallulah spoke more freely when the wind picked up, telling stories from her childhood like they'd always belonged to this place. And he noticed the way Asha moved when she thought no one was looking, her hands brushing her dress flat, her body relaxed, her face softened. He didn't miss how she lingered now when she touched him, her palm on his chest in the mornings, her fingers brushing his arm when she passed. She didn't ask for anything more than what they already had, but Reed felt it building between them. Not question, a certainty. That evening, they sat outside together while the sky turned orange. Asha stood at the edge of the fence, arms crossed, hair down loose over her shoulders. She wore the same dress still, but now it was fully repaired, stitched with care by Tallulah and herself, and pulled snug at the waist with a new leather belt Reed had given her. It framed her figure fully, her hips, her chest, the slope of her back, and he didn't look away when he noticed. Not anymore. Reed stepped beside her, arms crossed the same way. Roof's gonna need re-tearing, he said quietly. Asha tilted her head. So we stay long enough for that. Reed gave a small nod. She looked out toward the mountains. You think others made it out? From our camp. He He was quiet a beat, then said some, maybe not many. Asha breathed in through her nose, then out slow. We lived, she said. It should mean something. It does. She turned toward him. I want this to be more than shelter, Reed. I want roots, not just survival. He looked at her a long moment, then said, then stay. Plant him here. She stepped in close, her body pressed to his now. One hand rested on his chest, fingers spread. Her voice dropped low. I want to share your bed. Reed didn't answer with words. He leaned down, slow and sure, and kissed her. Not a brush of lips this time. A deep, steady connection. Her hand slid up his neck, her curves against him, her breath catching slightly. That night, she joined him beneath the furs. Not hurried, not desperate. Their bodies fit like they'd known each other longer than this long winter. Her hand guided his, slow and certain. The firelight flickered across her chest, where her dress had been eased down to her waist, her breasts full and bare against him, her thighs wrapped around his hips. They didn't speak during, just breathed, moved together, stayed. Later, she lay with her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, her fingers tracing the scar that curved along his ribs. I don't need promises, she whispered. You've got more than that, he said. In the morning, Ren saw them through the doorway, still curled together. She didn't speak, but when she brought water inside, she set it on the table with a softness Reed hadn't seen from her before. By midday, the land outside had begun to show green shoots along the fence line. And inside, something had rooted for good. By late spring, the land had fully returned to color. The hills beyond the cabin, once gray and barren, bloomed with yellow wildflowers and tough prairie grass. The ground was soft again, the kind that took footprints and held them for a while. The mule was shedding in clumps, birds nested under the eaves, and the creek Reed thought had dried out for good was now running, steady and clear. Inside the cabin, life had settled into something that didn't feel temporary anymore. Tocho had grown stronger. He spent more time outside than in, helping Reed mend fence lines and learning how to gather kindling without breaking the young saplings. His words came more freely now, half English, half Apache, but always precise, careful, like he was still learning how to trust his own voice. Ren had made herself a place, too. She rarely spoke more than a few words a day, but she was always moving, hauling water, repairing leather, fixing the hinges on the barn door. She had taken over the tack wall, organizing Reed's tools better than he ever had. She didn't smile often, but when she did, it was real. Tallulah spent more time in the garden plot she'd cleared behind the cabin. She coaxed vegetables from stubborn ground, humming while she worked, humming when she folded laundry, humming as she stitched. That sound had become part of the home now, low, warm, steady. Like her, and Asha had become something Reed hadn't dared hope for again. She wasn't loud about it. She didn't ask him to change or speak words he wasn't built for. But her presence filled the room in ways no one else's could. She shared his bed each night, her body curled beside his underworn furs, and woke with him each morning, shoulders brushing in the dim half-light. She cooked when she felt like it, worked when she didn't, and always made time to touch him, his shoulder, his back, the side of his face. Just enough to say, I'm here, still here. They never talked about marriage. Not formally. There was no preacher, no ring. But the decision had already been made, quietly, through the act of staying. That week, Reed built a second pen for chickens behind the barn. Tocho helped. The boy's hands were still small, but his grip was firm, and Reed showed him how to hold a hammer, how to line up nails with his thumb, how to test the weight of a beam before putting it into place. They worked in the sun without much talking, but by the end of the day, when the fence was up and the coop covered, Tocho looked at him and said, "Can I call you father?" Reed didn't speak right away. His throat tightened. He wiped his brow with his sleeve, looked the boy in the eye. "You already do," he said. That evening, Reed brought out an old oilskin pouch he hadn't opened in years. Inside was a silver Union belt buckle, worn smooth. He gave it to Tocho and said, "Was mine. Yours now." Tocho held it with both hands and nodded solemnly. The women watched from the porch. Asha smiled, her hand resting on her belly. It wasn't obvious yet, not to anyone but Reed, who had noticed the way she held her body differently these past few days. Slower, heavier, protective. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. Later that night, as they sat by the fire, Asha leaned against him. The boy had gone to sleep. Rin and Tallulah were talking softly by the stove, trading ideas for next season's planting. You know, Asha said, "My people believe new life comes when the earth is finally done grieving." Reed didn't say anything at first, just rested his hand over hers. Then he asked, "And what about people? Do we get that too?" Asha turned her face to his. "You tell me." He leaned in and kissed her slowly, deep, sure, like a man who no longer feared wanting something. That night, they lay together in silence, not out of habit, but out of peace. The kind that only comes after a long winter, after years of carrying grief with nowhere to set it down. Now it had a place, a name, a shape, family. By dawn, a soft breeze pushed through the cracks in the window. The smell of warm earth and pine drifted in. Reed stirred, then looked to his right. Asha, still asleep, hand resting just above her lower belly. He smiled. They had survived what had come before. Now, they were choosing what came next. And this time, no one would take it from them.